Hello and welcome to this PPTO apprenticeship session on QC and analysis, part 1. Quality control, or QC, is a fundamental part of the post-production process. Not only do we QC all our material throughout the whole process, ensuring the highest level of quality, we also pay particular attention to QCing our master before we start making dubs for distribution. An awful lot of things can happen in the post process, and it's very valuable to have a moment in time where we pause and look at the final content to make sure that it conforms to any compliance, conforms to technical specifications for distribution, and obviously has the best possible quality content that we can achieve with the environment that we have. And this starts really by having the correct QC environment. It's very important to QC things within low light, quiet, calm environment where you can really focus on the content on the screen in front of you. It's important to check that you have all the equipment that you need, that you can access the content, that you understand the specification that you might be QCing to, and that you have any notes made by the editor which will help you perform your QC. For instance, if there's a particular issue with a particular shot, then that may have been flagged in the suite and deemed acceptable, or maybe that's the only footage that you have, and therefore it's pointless failing that at QC. So it's great to have that information. A lot of QC is technical. Are we making sure that everything is correct to our legal parameters that we have to stick to? And also it can be contextually based. So are we looking at our content and understanding the context of which it's been created? So for instance, if something is documentary, handheld, then it's obviously going to be very shaky. There's going to be bits that are maybe blurred or out of focus. Whereas in a high-end drama, that's not going to be the context of which we're viewing the material in. So there's an awful lot of thought that goes into the QC, and it's an extremely important part of the process. It starts off by setting up that correct QC environment, using headphones for audio, making sure you're not interrupted, making sure it's a nice, quiet, calm environment so you can really focus on the screen and the audio. So QC stands for quality control. It's also referred to as QAR, so you create a quality assurance report. And it really consists of two main elements. Compliance checking, does it meet the specifications? And quality checking, does it meet the quality needed or expected? Compliance requires a standard to be applied to. What am I complying to? I'm complying to our standard in-house specification or to a distribution specification, for instance. And quality needs a measure to reference against. It's not just subjective, it's not all down to the QC operator to say, oh, well, the quality of this isn't good enough. You need something to measure it against. You need to understand the context of that content. Really, QC occurs throughout the entire process, from acquisition, ingest, offline, online, and deliverables. There's an awful lot of things that we can check as we go. So within acquisition, are we acquiring the right format in our camera or in any other form of acquisition that we might have, sourcing stock footage, etc.? Is it the correct frame per second? So is this US stock footage at 2997 when my program is actually being made 25 frames per second? Is it the correct aspect ratio? Is this old SD archive footage when I'm actually making a 4K presentation, or maybe even this is going out on IMAX? The LUT used, so that's lookup table, so that's any grading baked in or metadata information. Is the audio quality good enough? Is it the correct color space? Do we have on location backups? That's a good kind of QC check because you're maintaining quality. And then moving to ingest. Obviously we're checking a lot of the same things again. We can also check for any artifacts which have been sort of baked into that acquisition material. So is there any dropout? Is there any dead pixels or any aliasing issues or anything like that? And we'll look at kind of subjects like that as the course progresses. At the offline stage, even though if we're doing a traditional offline process, then we'll be working on low res media. So we're not that worried about encoding artifacts because it's just proxy media, it's not the final stuff. But we can still check that our edit is going to pass PSE, so the photosensitive epilepsy. There are very strict rules over what constitutes a flash, how many flashes you can have per second, what's the distance of frames in between flashes, etc. You can also have a look at your material. Just because it's compressed doesn't mean that it's useless, obviously, because the creative process needs at least a standard quality to be working with. So you will be able to spot things like whether they're underexposed or overexposed, or if we've done any frame rate conversions or frame rate changes. You know, there's lots of things that we can pick up in offline that's worth keeping an eye on. In the online, we're now working with broadcast quality material. It's the high-end stuff. And here, obviously, we can double check the PSE. Now we've got full res. So for that kind of compliance, there's editorial compliance things that we can check here. So is there anything in the content that's not acceptable to the end destination? Things like alcohol in UAE or smoking in a car in France is you're not allowed to show, for instance, in a commercial. There's all sorts of rules. We're looking at everything high end, so really the editor should always have her or his eyes on quality on every single shot, making sure that the metadata is correct for everything. And then as the final audio comes in, we can check it against the R128 loudness and make sure that the dynamic range is correct. And then comes the main QC that we're discussing here, which is the QC on the master, which will turn into any deliverable content. So here there's an awful lot to check because essentially we're checking for everything upstream. Post-production can be a long, complicated process. It can be done up against a very, very tight schedule. Not everything runs smoothly through that process, and often timelines can get contracted. So not everybody has had a chance to have an eye on quality at every stage. So it all comes down to that master QC to make sure that you've captured everything. That might be the build that's needed for the distributor, so having a clock or an ident on the front. It could be compliance such as PSE, and then it's all of the technical things that need to be checked. The video levels, the audio levels, making sure that you've got all the audio there, if it's 5.1 or it's stereo, etc. There's an awful lot to check at that stage, and that's where really the main QC comes in. Initial checks of content to flag potential issues and the work required. It's also suitable for the content for the job in hand, typically as part of the ingest process. So as we've said, you double check when you acquire, when you ingest, and when you go through offline and all the rest of it. So you're really checking the initial checks on content. If you imagine you spot a problem then, you've just saved an awful lot of time further upstream, because if it's spotted in the online, then you've got to then go back to the rushes, you've got to try and find a solution, and that's quite time consuming. Periodic checks during post to identify issues early. That's a core function of QC. Missing an issue here can involve the next phase of work being invalid and useless. The QC at this stage needs clear instructions on what's being checked for and what it's not being checked for. There's no point commenting on content that is going to be changed or replaced, for instance. Final checks of content is a core function of QC, as we touched on the last slide, to make sure it meets quality standards and delivery specifications. At each stage, the QC comments and feedback need to be as helpful and descriptive as possible. The aim here is to avoid another operator having to re-queue and examine the issue for a better clarification. So very often when I do QC training, when someone performs their QC test, I give them a QC form to fill out, and I say, work as if you're on the night shift and you're going to go home, and the morning person is going to pick up this QC report, and it needs to explain the situation perfectly for them. It needs to be clear, it needs to be concise, and it needs to be using the right terminology. And obviously these are things which you're tested on in the QC assessment that happens towards the end of the course. Okay, compliance mandatory checks. A lot of things in the content are subjective or creative. Some of the things we've talked about contextually, such as some of the camera being a bit blurred, etc. You can have discussions about that. Some of it will pass, some of it will not pass, based on the environment. However, there are some things that you absolutely have to check and you have to make sure is correct, because if you don't, it'll be rejected at the broadcaster and it's not going on air. And of course, you can imagine all the problems that throws up. It causes delays. You might have to stop another job in order to make fixes. It takes up resources. It costs money. You've upset the client. You've acted in an unprofessional manner. There's lots of ramifications for that. So QC, as we keep saying, is absolutely essential to the process working. So some of those compliance checks that are mandatory, we have to make sure that we have a delivery standard that we're checking against. As we said in the beginning, with the QC environment, it's really important that we have the right environment to QC, and that includes having the access to the kit, access to the files, and access to the specification. So if we've made a master and it's going out to the BBC, then we need the BBC specification, because that's what we're checking against. Compliance elements can include, if it's file-based, obviously the wrapper that we've used, which is whether it's a .mov or is it a .mxf, the codec, is it ProRes, is it AVC intra, metadata. For DPP, there's a lot of metadata that's mandatory, but also we're checking our file integrity to make sure that the metadata within the file is correct. If it is 25 frames per second, does the metadata say that it's 25 frames per second? And then all our essence elements within inside the wrapper. So, does it have 4 channels of audio if it's supposed to have 4 channels of audio, for instance? If you're doing file-based delivery for UK broadcast, then AS11 compliance is a fundamental part of the check that you need to do. So the DPP AS11 has a full range of checks that need to be made, which are quite specific for it. And it includes an automated QC, which we'll touch on later, and it includes an eyeball QC as well by a human being. If you're delivering overseas, some places do still take tapes, and then obviously you have to make sure you've used the right format. Is there the right recording standard? Have you done your record reports so that they understand the time codes of the contents of the tape, etc. Very often you'll deliver a file which will have a certain build requirement. So it might have some lineup at the beginning called bars and tone, which just allow technology to be configured with the color values and the audio levels from your post-production facility. It's not commonly used nowadays. But almost everything has a slate or a clock beforehand, and then a little bit of black before the start of program. Then we have the content. You might have a freeze frame towards the end. You might have some black afterwards. So the way that the file is built, the sequence, the timeline settings, if you like, need to be checked to make sure that they're correct. Other mandatory checks for compliance, checking the video levels, the audio levels. So within a technical realm, everything needs to be defined. We can't just say, we have brightness, we have color. We have to know our minimum and maximum values of what's legal and what's allowed to be broadcast. So we need to check those and make sure that everything's correct. And the same goes for audio levels as well. PSE, we've touched on photosensitive epilepsy. That's absolutely required for broadcast, and it can be done in an automated way, fortunately. But if you get a fail, you need to know how to read that failure report and then suggest some remedial action to the editor. Others, yes, there's lots more, and there's a whole host of things that we check for technically, for video, for audio, for the quality, as well as compliance mandatory checking. Another form of checking is for editorial compliance. So different regions will have different rules, and I've touched on some of those already. So some content's not allowed for legal or local regional reasons, smoking, swearing, nudity, sex, etc. But also you might be protecting people's identity, especially in a documentary or news environment. So maybe that's going to involve blurring of people's names, or of their faces, or of car number plates, etc. Also, is product placement allowable? So sometimes something will be filmed, such as, I don't know, a bottle or a packet on edge of frame, or someone picks something up as they're having a bit of dialogue, and that might not actually be acceptable. So you may then have to cover that up and sort of put a generic face over the top of that packet, like a pack replacement or something else. There's lots of reasons that you might need for editorial reasons to cover something up or remove something from the edit. Okay, so we've talked about the file makeup. We've talked about the technical standards which you need to check against the specification. We touched on some of them anyway. And then we've had a brief look at some sort of examples of editorial compliance that you need to check for as well. Now we're going to have a look at a couple of ways of recording those faults and explaining it to them, to the people who are going to read them in a clear and concise way. So when we're looking at our video screen, we'll be watching it and we'll be looking for some kind of error occurring in the video. And there's a number of different ways of reporting that. So here we've got on your QC report, you could say that it's audio related, video related, or film related comments. And then you could kind of give a brief description of what the problem is. And then you can explain where on the screen the problem might be. So let's say that there's some dropout on the screen and it's on the left hand side in the middle, sort of, let's say halfway up the screen on the left hand side. So there you could say that it's V for video related comment. You make a comment saying there's dropout, and then you could say ML, and immediately someone's going to go to the middle left and have a look and see that dropout there. It's just much easier than saying there's dropout on this frame. It actually gives people the area to go and look at, and then they might decide that it needs to be fixed, or they may not, may decide that actually it's okay for whatever reason. Another way of doing that is to use zones. Now these are quite useful because you're often asked how annoying the fault is. Okay, so how much of an impact that's going to have on the audience. And obviously anything in zone 0, as seen there, is going to be much more annoying than the outer zone. So in our example, halfway up on the left hand side is in the outer zone. So if you were in a rush and you had some dropout in that area, you may say, look, we haven't got time to fix it, it's not that annoying, we'll let it go. Whereas if it's in MC or in zone 0, it's going to be much more annoying, much more visible. So even if you're in a rush, you might say, right, okay, look guys, we need to fix this because the quality isn't high enough. So it's useful in determining the annoyance level of the artifact, as well as explaining to someone in your QC report where that artifact might be. So not all QC is done by human beings sitting down in front of a screen and listening and watching. An awful lot of it can be achieved through an automated QC. Especially a lot of the technical compliance things that we were talking about on the frame on the slide earlier. So automated QC, very, very simple. It often works from like a watch folder or hot folder. You drop your master file into it. The program is monitoring that folder. It sees a new file. It waits for it to finish being written there. Then it runs an analysis and it will kick out a PDF report at the end of it, or it will update your digital asset management system, whatever it might be, and it'll let you know whether it's passed or failed. There's the same need to understand the specification. So within your AQC, you may have a spec for DPP, you may have a spec for BBC, a spec for YouTube, spec for this, that, and the other. So you need to make sure that you're using the right preset to check against it, just the same way as you would if you were doing it manually. You'd make sure you had the right specification in front of you. It's a templated software file-based QC process, and it saves an awful lot of time. It's great if you think you get the master, you run it through this, and while it's analysing it, you can get on with the visual and oral QC. And then at the end, you've got all your notes from watching and listening, and then you can check all the technical compliance stuff by reading the PDF report. And in fact, if the PDF report comes out with, depending on how it's configured, I configure mine so that it says pass in the subject, in the file name of the PDF. If you see it says pass, that's great. You didn't even have to look at it. Depending on the hardware, it can be faster than real time. It's always faster than real time nowadays, which is great. There's no way you put an hour-long program in there and it takes an hour to process. Machines are much faster than that nowadays. You might need to transfer the data into that watch folder though. It might be on a different server in a different location. So that transfer time does add on to it, definitely. But it's really important to know what an AQC is checking and what it's not checking. So it can easily check for things like for the file makeup. So what resolution, what frame rate, what audio codec, what duration. It can check the build. It can see if there's a clock. It can see the program start time code. It can see loads and loads of things. It's brilliant. Some things it can't check, a lot of visual problems, a lot of oral problems. It can't check title safety. So you still need both. You need a human being and you need automated QC in order to make sure that your content will pass. So there's still a need for an eyeball QC, definitely. You check for aesthetic issues as well as technical issues. And it's easier if an AQC is doing some of the work. Like I said, you put it in, you wait while it's doing its processing, you can do your visual and oral QC. You need to check the AQC results and summarize any actions or reports. So there could be some kind of fault that it's flagging. So you put that in your QC report and report back the same way as you would with a visual fault, for instance. For DPP AS11 delivery, you absolutely have to complete both, and you have to provide evidence of having completed an automated QC and a human eyeball QC as well. So you do a QC report. It needs to be logged, what the faults might be, or if it's a pass, that's very valuable information. So it needs to actually be done in a report, which is usually a PDF style that gets filled in, or a Word document that gets sent off. And it's everything that you check. So you're checking for your technical spec, your broadcast QC. If you're doing restoration or archive work, then you'll QC it so that the edit suite understands the quality of the content that they're getting. It might just be that you do a spot check QC, actually. So with these videos that I'm doing, that I'm recording now, I'm not going to sit back and watch an hour-long version of this to check that it's been recorded okay. I'm going to spot check it. So I'm going to watch kind of say 1 minute every 5, and therefore just make sure that the recording's okay. So there are different types of checks that you can do at different times. So the current UK DPP system wants the type of errors flagged in one of 3 categories. So there's mandatory, there's technical warning, and there's editorial warning. Okay, so a mandatory warning is tests that must be passed to meet the basic delivery standards. If a program fails one of these tests, it must be fixed before delivery to the broadcaster. And we touched on that earlier when we were looking at those mandatory compliance checks. A technical warning could be when you're doing your report, you see something and you say this needs to be reviewed in the suite and fixed if at all possible. So that could be something visual. That could be some blanking, for instance. So some black edging comes in at the side of frame because the content has been re-racked slightly. So that's an example of something that's a technical warning. Or there's an editorial warning. Indicate problems which may harm viewers' enjoyment of the content. However, they may also be unavoidable. So for instance, if we're talking about our documentary, which has some shaky handheld camera work and it goes in and out of focus, that may harm viewers' enjoyment of the content, but it's quite unavoidable because that's the only footage. You can't, if it's a documentary filming something live, you can't go back and redo it. So that's all the content you've got. So context definitely comes into play in this. The ITU has a 5-point scale, and this is something which you will use in your QC assessment. When you listen and watch, you will come up with certain faults in a QC. Don't forget we QC to find something wrong, so therefore we are probably going to find something wrong. We then need to decide what to do about it. So one of the best ways that we can indicate to the editor or the producer what to do about it is to give it a grade out of 5, for instance. So anything that's grade 1 or 2 is a fail and it needs to be fixed. So it's very annoying or annoying. Grade 3 is slightly annoying. Grade 4 is perceptible but not annoying. And grade 5 is completely acceptable. So you may say, well, why mention it? Well, it's very helpful if you send a QC report with the copy for someone to read that, because then they know that it's been seen and it's been signed off as being acceptable. So they don't then have to re-mention it. So let's say we're QCing something and there's a repeated frame. And that happens quite a lot. So someone is walking across screen, they've got nice fluid motion, and then it seems a bit jumpy because there's actually a couple of repeated frames and the motion isn't consistent over frames. So that would be very annoying. And that's definitely something that needs to be fixed. If there was, let's say, some slight blanking happening on one of the sides and it's only a pixel or 2, then you could consider that to be slightly annoying. So it doesn't absolutely have to be fixed, but it would be really good if it was fixed. And again, we're thinking back to the previous slide where we've got a number of definitions that we could also use along those lines. 4 could be things like dropout, or maybe they've put some film dirt on there intentionally to give it some kind of graded or authentic look, but actually they put it on a bit too thickly. They've been a bit overzealous and it's perceptible, not really annoying, but a little bit over the top, and it's something that could be reconsidered. So this grading is quite important to get your head around. If you're watching something, I know it seems subjective, annoying. The term annoying doesn't seem very technical, does it? But it's a good way of translating technical information into something that humans can understand. So if you're going to write a technical report, how annoying something is a nice way for someone who might not be that technical, like potentially some producers or someone else associated who's going to have to read that report, to understand that something is grade 1 or 2. It needs to definitely be fixed. Some territories use a simpler format, which is a 3-point system. So 1 is a comment, 2 is a pass but of concern, so should be fixed if possible, and 3 is a fail. So it's quite confusing because it's the other way around. So grade 1 here is just a comment, whereas grade 1 on the 5-point is a fail. The 3-point system is mentioned in the documentation for the course, so it's something that you need to be aware of. But what you will be using in the assessment is the 5-point scale. So I would definitely recommend that you start thinking about things when you QC or when you watch stuff at home, how you would grade things, with 1 and 2 being a definite fail, down to 5 just being a comment. The EBU has a number of categories. EBU is the European Broadcast Union, and they come up with lots of standards and specifications for broadcasters to follow. Anything we do is going to be broadcast, so therefore we need to pay attention to how broadcasters speak and think and how they evaluate things. So here are 4 categories which the EBU can break things down into. Each QC test item falls into one of the following categories. Regulatory. A QC item specifying a test that must be performed due to requirements set by a regulator or government. So what would be an example of that? So the PSE checking, photosensitive epilepsy, that would be a regulatory check, because there are regulations about what is acceptable for PSE content and what isn't. Absolute, defined in a standards document including a standard scale, may have a defined pass-fail threshold. As a user, I ought to be able to compare results of different QC devices and see the same result. So an absolute fail might be, I've used the wrong codec. You asked for a ProRes and I've given you an AVC intra. So I can compare that result on different QC devices because they're going to interrogate the codec and understand that it's the wrong one. Objective, measurable in a quantitative way against a defined scale, but no standard threshold is agreed. There may be no formal spec or standard, but an agreed method is implied or exists in the test definition. As a user, I ought to be able to compare the results of different QC devices if I configure the same thresholds. So that's a bit of a mouthful. So essentially what we're saying here is some things are fall into the objective category, where it's looking at the quality of something, but there's no standard threshold. So this is very much where the quality of the footage comes into account and the context comes into account. So this is very much the type of QC artifact that we were discussing earlier, where we were saying things can be out of focus, the camera work can be a bit wobbly. It might be that you only had one day with that actor and this is the footage from that one day, and maybe it's not so great, but this is something that we have to use. Or maybe there was a failure on set and a lot of the lighting didn't work, so you've really had to push the exposure a lot, so some of the shots look a little bit grainy, a little bit darker. So on that, there's no set standard threshold that's agreed, so therefore whether it passes or fails is a bit more objective. Subjective content may be measurable, but with only a degree of confidence. A failure threshold is not defined or is very vague, and it may require human interpretation of results. As a user, I can't expect different QC devices to report identical results. So subjective content is one step further than objective. So if there's things which are not technical in nature, that can't be defined, and that don't produce a value that I can check in the post house and they can check up the broadcaster, then it becomes a subjective issue. AS11 DPP delivery, it's delivered as a file, and as I said earlier, there's a lot of specific metadata that goes on, and it's a very well defined standard, and there's lots of QC checks that need to be done as part of this. So you might, if you're uploading to YouTube, you might put it as part of your QC, use software like Media Info, for instance, that does an analysis of the metadata to make sure that it's the right frame rate, that it's the right resolution, that it's the right codec, that it's the right wrapper, things like that. That's absolutely fine. And you would do that as part of an AS11 check as well, but there's also an awful lot of other things that they check at broadcasters that you have to make sure is correct at the same time. So it's a much more complicated QC than simply a YouTube delivery, for instance. That goes on to audio as well as video. It checks levels, it checks lineup, it checks time code, it checks metadata. So you can see the complexity of the specification for AS11 DPP requirement is very strong. It's very detailed. So if you're doing a QC, you must make sure you have the time and the equipment in your QC environment to make sure that you can actually check for this. It's no good someone saying it's for DPP, they take ABC insert, MXF file, that's fine, send it out. We say, well, I have to check AS11, I have to do an AQC, I have to do a human QC, and these are all the types of things that I need to check for within that. So I need the specification to make sure that I hit every single technical parameter for that delivery, as well as then looking through the audio and the video and making sure that all that's perfect as well, and reporting back on a 1 to 5 scale on any artifacts that I might find. For a typical UK broadcast QC, these are some of the just very standard checks that you would do. And so hopefully you're beginning to see that the QC, it really does take time, and it really is quite specific in its nature. AQC results are checked and either outright fails or notes added to qualify. So PSE and loudness, things like that, are going to be checked. If they fail, then they need to be corrected. Metadata checked and confirmed. Does it correctly relate to the content? If you have levels, bars and tone, lineup, things like that, requested in the spec, then are they present? The same goes with the slate or the clock. Is everything set to the correct timings? Is everything, does it say the correct information on the slate? So the slate will contain whether the audio is mono or stereo, whether it's 5.1, it'll say whether it's 16:9, it'll have a lot of details on that clock, and you need to make sure that it has all the correct details. Does it have black before 10 hours? Does the program start on 10 hours? If there are end credits, are the timings correct? Does the structure meet the broadcaster's requirement? A lot of programs and commercials have a freeze on the end. Not so much in the UK on commercials, but programming it's still quite popular. So the last frame is basically repeated for 5 seconds or 10 seconds or whatever the spec may need. You check for blanking errors, which is black edges. You check for crushed or clipped blacks or clipped whites. So we're looking at video levels there. We understand our technical parameters, what is legal video level and what's an illegal video level, and we do cover those on this course. And we look at whether we're breaking those rules, essentially, in our QC. We check our title safety issues. So titles have to be within a certain area on screen if they're legal text. We touch on that in a while. We check audio for mono elements as expected. So, for instance, a lot of voiceovers are just recorded mono, and then they're added into a stereo mix with the music. We check our sync, lip sync, particularly on close-ups, but generally on everything that we do. We check for audio or video disturbances, things like moire, which we'll cover, mic rustle or any kind of audio clicks. And we check the file names are correct, and that the AQC, the PSE, and any eyeball QC reports all match. That seems like a fairly simple thing, but if your program has a specific name and let's say it has a clock number, so it actually has a series of numbers and letters referring to what that is, and the system that plays that out at the right time in the right place is pre-configured with that file name, if you name something incorrectly, it might get lost in the transmission chain. So one common error that we see is someone uses an O instead of a 0. If you use an O instead of a 0, that's incorrect. It might not pass through the automated process. So you always have to make sure that the file names are correct, and they're correct on every single ancillary bits of data, such as the AQC that you provide. The most common QC issues are worth knowing because they're the most immediate things that you can check for. So blanking errors, black edges at the side of frame, compression artifacts, and we do run through some examples of that, and you do a QC on some material, so you get some practice on that within the course, but I imagine you'll spend time at work doing that as well. Focus issues, frame rate conversion issues, so if something was 2997 and we've made it 25, then there's an awful lot that can go wrong in that process. Luminance shifts, could be a grading error, suddenly it gets a bit brighter, suddenly it gets a bit darker. Pixel failures, that covers a whole host of artifacts which can just appear on screen. People use different names: dead pixels, stuck pixels, hot pixels, pixel failures. Essentially, there's some kind of dropout on the screen, and you need to isolate it and work out what it is. In the old tape days, then you used to get loads of pixel problems, and they really were pixels, so little square blocks on the screen, tiny little things that were basically an error in the recording on the tape, and so you used to have to go into a suite and paint it out and then re-record it onto tape. So I think that's where the idea of pixel failures comes in. But essentially you're looking for any kind of dropout that appears on screen. Drone or GoPro type of footage inherently often has a lot of compression issues or lens distortion, it's lower quality. That comes down to a contextual decision, whether it's good enough to include. Audio clicks and pops, quite common. Title safe errors, every editor should work within title safety. However, things regularly fall outside title safety. So it's definitely something to pick up in QC. So often when you have a lot of titles, then the spelling could be off, the fonts could be used, style, position, etc. could drift. So having a good idea of consistency throughout a program is very important. Overexposed content does happen quite a lot. Gamut errors are less often now at eyeball QC because often it's been through an automated QC which picked them up, and this is your video levels that we're talking about. Gamut is essentially content, visual content, which falls outside the color space required. So HD content has a set value of color ranges. It's called Rec 709. And if something contains illegal video levels or illegal brightness levels, it falls outside that range. It's called a gamut error. And it's usually picked up by EQC nowadays. Okay, so it's worth touching on PSE, FPA at the moment. It's very important that you understand the rules and regulations for this. The Office of Communications, Ofcom, is the UK government approved regulatory and competition authority for broadcasting. It has wide-ranging powers across television, radio, postal sectors. Flickering or intermittent images and certain types of regular pattern can cause problems for some viewers who have photosensitive epilepsy. The guidelines that Ofcom have drawn up, following consultation with leading medical opinion in the area, has been done with the aim of reducing the risk of exposure to potentially harmful stimuli, i.e. flickering or intermittent images can trigger epileptic fits in people who have photosensitive epilepsy. So everything is checked to make sure that the risk is reduced as much as possible, so it won't trigger those epileptic fits. So we're working in a technical area, everything has to be defined and everything has to be checked. So part of that definition is to state what a flash is, how often flashes can happen, what constitutes a flash, but it's built into the regulations that television broadcasters must take precautions to maintain a low level of risk to viewers who have photosensitive epilepsy. Now, we're not eliminating that risk 100%, and that's really important to remember for a number of reasons, really. One of them is that nothing is perfect, and there's an awful lot of work that goes into PSE to understand and refine the data that we have to make it less and less risky, the content that we use, which in turn means that the software algorithms that we use to check need to be updated. There's no point, buying a solution in 2010 and then in 2030 using the same one, because there will have been lots of updates in the meantime. 2023 there were large updates, and more will be coming. So it's not about eliminating risk, it's about slowly over time reducing that risk to an absolute minimum. And this is an actual regulation for all broadcasters, so they're legally entitled to do this. They have to do it. So let's have a look at summary of the rules. What are we talking about flashing? Well, we're talking about flashing luminance. Luminance is brightness. So flashing brightness of more than 3 flashes per second, or saturated red flashes of more than 3 per second, or harmful patterns made up of 5 or more stripes made of light and dark content. So what's a flash? Well, it's 3 large changes of luminance per second, or 3 large changes of a saturated red color per second, or harmful patterns made up of 5 or more stripes made of light or dark content. If you have 9 frames in between those, then it resets the count. So it's 3 per second is what's allowed, nothing more than that. But if you have 9 frames, 9 clear frames, then it restarts the count again from 1. So it's 1, 2, 3 again from that stage on. So you could have 3 flashes, 9 clear frames with no flashes, then another 3 flashes, then 9 clear frames of no flashes, then another 3 flashes, and that would pass. That's absolutely fine. So we're looking for changes in luminance, changes in saturated red colors, and patterns of 5 or more stripes. There is a task that you do on the course where you look into those specifications in a little bit more detail. So if we say a change in luminance, as we say, it's a technical area, you have to define what that change in luminance is. Obviously, there's lots of changes in brightness all the time in video. So what actually constitutes a flash? What actually constitutes saturated red? That's something that you'll look at on the course in a task. Okay, time to look at specifications. Here we have a spec for beam. Beam is a distributor of commercials. So every post house that works on commercials will have their master, they will perform a QC, they will then transcode that into a Beam spec file and then upload that into the Beam system. So that's one single file uploading into Beam, and then Beam will distribute it to all of the broadcasters in the country. And there are many, many, many broadcasters. Okay, so let's have a little look at this spec. So we have naming convention. There's a clock number on every UK commercial, and it must be unique. Every commercial has a very, very unique file name and clock number, and the naming of the file that's uploaded into the Beam system must be named after that clock number. The commercial should be preceded by a silent countdown clock of 7 seconds duration, followed by 3 seconds of black and silence prior to the first active frame. The commercial should be followed by 10 seconds freeze of the last active frame. So here we're looking at the build. So when you create your timeline and export it to your master, you should have that clock. It should have the relevant information on that clock. It should be starting at the right time code and be on for the right duration. The same goes with the black. You know, you're paying attention to the build. Some files have a lot of black after the end of the freeze as well. So you have to make sure that the build is correct, or it'll get rejected. So there's a lot of generic advice here. Anything that's unusual, such as if it has 4 channels of audio or if it starts on black, it should be noted on the clock. All video signals should conform to broadcast regulations, including loudness specifications, and be free of artifacts. Video levels should not exceed 700 millivolts or fall below 0 millivolts. We do cover this in video levels, although EBU Rec 103 tolerances will be accepted. So that probably sounds a bit like gobbledygook at the moment, but we do cover on video levels what 700 millivolts mean. Essentially, you've got a legal parameter of video levels where your brightness cannot exceed, where your black cannot fall below, but there is a little bit of tolerance allowed, and that's defined in a document called Rec 103. So that's basically saying, make sure your video levels are legal, and what I mean by legal is defined in this document, Rec 103. Okay, captions should conform to Clearcast guidelines. So Clearcast is a clearance body which checks every commercial before it goes on air to make sure it's not full of lies, basically, and to make sure that it conforms to Ofcom regulations. So we're talking legal text has to be in the right area, has to be certain rules and regulations which we'll cover on that text as well. It passes PSE and it doesn't have any false claims in it. Things like that. UK commercials have the first 6 frames and the last 6 frames silent. So that's part of the specification. If we say something must be silent, okay, should be completely mute is the terminology they use, then we have to define what we mean by that, completely mute. So what is silence? They've given you a reference value. Silence is measured as a value being below -70 dBFS. So your automated QC is going to be checking that. That'll be set up in your template, and it'll say within the first 6 frames and the last 6 frames, is there any audio value recognizable or perceptible above the value of -70 dBFS? Okay, so that's a good Beam specification, and we haven't really even looked at what file type they take yet. They're just saying name it like this, make sure the clock details are like this, your video levels, your audio levels, make sure it conforms to Clearcast guidelines for title safety, for silence, etc. Then we move on to the file type that they take. So if they're going to take HD 50i, 50 being 50 frames per second, 50 fields per second interlaced. So it's 25 frames per second content. Each of those frames is broken into 2 fields, so it's 50 fields interlaced. The codec of the file that they want is Apple ProRes 42HQ. The container, the wrapper, is QuickTime, so it's going to be a .mov file. The audio codec is linear PCM with a little endian setting. They'll take 16 or 24 bit depth, but they want 48 kilohertz sample rate. They do want interlaced material. We know that because it's HD50i, not HD25p. 25p would be 25 frames a second progressive. 50i obviously is interlaced material. So it's interlaced upper field first. When we interlace content, there's a decision to be made whether it should be display the first field first, or the top field first, or the bottom field first. All of HD displays the upper field first. We cover that later in the course, don't worry. Chroma 42, that's covered later. HD 1920 by 1080, display aspect ratio 16:9, and then the audio, they just want 2 channels, and it can be stereo left and right, or it could be mono across both channels. So that's the technical makeup of the file, and that's a pretty standard technical makeup. You'd be very, very familiar with setups like that within no time at all. We also have audio levels to comply to. So our audio requirement is R128, which is a loudness recommendation. So we're not looking for a peak. We're not looking for minus 10 dBFS as the loudest measurement. We're actually looking for an integrated value measured throughout the whole duration of the content. And it should be minus 23 LUFS. That's loudness units full scale. But you do have a tolerance there of 0.5 LUFS. They do also mention on the right hand side their title safety. So that's 16:9 EBU R95-1. Now you might be thinking, wow, not much of this is making sense at the moment. And that is absolutely fine. What we're doing is introducing you to these concepts, and slowly over time we'll build up that information, and then you'll get more practical experience, and all this will become very, very clear over time, especially things like title safety. You'll understand what R95-1 is, you'll understand interlaced upper field first. Everything comes together. We do a section on loudness as well, so that's explained in more depth. This is here really just to show you the depth of detail within a specification, and if you get it wrong, it'll just get rejected. So if you learn this stuff and you QC with your spec, next year you're checking everything off on the spec, then you know everything's going to go out nice and smoothly. Here's another example, and a very, very different kind of example as well. So this is quite an old spec actually. It's for US broadcast. So if you see that the clock duration is different, they don't want a hold, they don't want any freeze on the end. They want an H.264 QuickTime with a bit rate of 50 megabits per second. So it's very, very different to a ProRes that the last place was accepting. And the audio value is not a loudness value, it is a peak program meter value. So it's just a peak loudness. So the loudest point on that program is going to be all that anybody is worrying about. They're not going to be worrying about the whole duration of the content within a loudness value. And you can see the naming conventions in the bottom right hand side is different there. It must end with an H, it can't be longer than 15 characters long, etc. So each station actually has a different spec, but fortunately we have people getting together and coming up with common distribution formats. So that Beam spec you upload to Beam, and then they will transcode it into all the different station specifications and make 100 copies that go out, all in an automated fashion. It's very, very helpful. But you'll probably end up delivering to different territories, and therefore you'll have to work with different types of specifications. And obviously online specs are different to broadcast specs, and all the rest of it. Lovely. Thanks so much for listening. I know that's a lot of information to take on. But we have discussions where you can ask questions and we can explain things in more depth, and it's all good background, slowly building up this critical mass of data which then falls into place. Thanks so much for listening.